Hello and welcome. Here we are in a time of history that many are saying is the time when the Messiah is going to come back. This is the generation when he's coming back. And we're going to do a series of short videos that explain important things that Christians in this day and age need to know. And the first thing I'd like to share with you is the importance of biblical righteousness. Biblical righteousness as a subject is not something you'll find in a Bible dictionary. Generally, there's different types of righteousness I'll talk about, but what I'd like to cover tonight is biblical righteousness. Biblical righteousness is, in a nutshell, what God requires of you, what God is looking for from you, from me as an individual. But the best way to explain it is to look at what he required from different people at different times. So the first example is going to be Noah with the ark. You'll find that in Genesis chapter 6. And in Genesis chapter 6, God has decided to destroy the world because the thoughts of man were evil. Their thoughts had become evil and wicked in every way. So it's to do with the thought life. The thought life was wicked, and so God decided to destroy the world. But Noah, verse 8 of chapter 6, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. So God says, build a boat, a ship, a giant ship. It takes Noah over 100 years. God is very specific on what he wants him to do. And when you get to the end of chapter 6, it says, thus did Noah according to all that God commanded him, he did. That's interesting, isn't it? Noah did everything God commanded him to do. That's a key verse, because chapter 7 verse 1 then says, and the Lord said unto Noah, come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation. I have found you righteous in my eyes, God says. So, there's Noah. Noah has done everything he was told to do, and God says, I have found you righteous in my eyes. So Noah did everything he was told to do, and God says, I found you righteous. Why was he the one person found righteous? Because he did what God told him to do. If we go to Genesis chapter 11, a few chapters later, we'll find the account of Abraham. It's actually chapter 12. There you go. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. So there's an instruction. Instructions to leave your country, to leave your kindred and your father's house, your family. So leave your nation, your people, your family, and go to a land I'll show you. 4 requirements, 4 clear instructions. But here's the promise. Remember, Noah had an amazing promise. Build this boat and I will save your family. I'm going to destroy the world. And here's the promise. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So Abram departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. Oh, what did it say? And Lot went with him. He said, leave your family. Lot went with him. Okay, as you follow the story slowly, you will find that Lot hung around with Abraham for quite a while. Abraham did leave his nation and his people. Abraham did go to the land of Canaan, but God didn't actually clarify the promise in its fulfillment until he separated from Lot. They went down to Egypt, they came back. But eventually, Abraham separates from Lot. And unlike the films you see where Lot decided to leave, well, that's not correct, because the Bible says it was Abraham that told him to leave. But we get to chapter 15, verse 6, and again it's talking about righteousness. This is one of the key verses that's used by Paul. It's used in lots of places in the New Testament to explain righteousness, and it says in chapter 15, verse 6, and he believed in the Lord, and he counted to him for righteousness. So, and he, that's Abram, believed in the Lord, and he, that's God, counted it to him, Abram, for righteousness. The word believe is persuaded. He was fully persuaded. So Abram was persuaded. He did everything eventually that God told him to do. So what is God asking you to do, Christian? What is he asking me to do? He's not asking you to build a boat. He's not asking you to leave your nation, your people, your family and go to a land. I'll show you. This time, under the new covenant, God has one simple, precise, clear and exact instruction of which there is no getting out, and when I share it with you, unfortunately, it's checkmate, you're stuck. You will find in Matthew, Mark and Luke, you'll know about the Mount of Transfiguration, where Jesus took Peter, James and John and they went up to the Mount of Transfiguration. When they went up to the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus shone brightly and white, and Elijah and Moses appeared. And Peter says, this is really good, let us build 3 booths. One for you, Jesus, one for Elijah, one for Moses. Okay. They think the millennial reign of Christ has come. But then a cloud descends, and this cloud, as it descends, the disciples are very shocked, and a voice says in Matthew, the voice is also in Mark, and it's in Luke. The voice says, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. We all know that, but how many of you know the next 2 words? Because that's the only commandment God the Father gave to the followers of Jesus Christ, is the next 2 words. The next 2 words are, hear him. And you will find that hear him is in Matthew, in Mark and in Luke. Hear him. Jesus repeatedly says, he who does the will of my Father. He who does the will of my Father. That is a really key understanding of knowing what the Father's will is. And it's interesting, when Jesus is talking about the will of the Father, as they come down the mountain, he says to the disciples of the Mount of Transfiguration, do not tell anybody about this vision until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. Why? Because it doesn't apply until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. Don't tell anybody until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. So that commandment comes into force, and we're told about it, once the Son of Man is risen from the dead. That's why it's in Matthew, Mark and Luke. It's there because we need to know it. Hear him, hear him. So do we hear him? Do we do that? Jesus in Matthew 7 says, not everyone that says unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father which is in heaven. So what's the will of the Father in heaven? Well, it's very simple. Hear him. Hear Jesus Christ. Many will say to me, that's to Jesus Christ, this is Matthew 7, many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name? And in your name cast out devils, and in your name do mighty, dunamis in the Greek, wonderful works. And then will I profess unto them, then will Jesus Christ profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you that work iniquity, it says in the King James, but the Greek word behind that, if you translate it into English, is lawlessness. You that work lawlessness. He then goes on to explain this account, and he says, therefore, I'm about to explain to you, whosoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him unto a wise man that built his house upon the rock. The wise man hears Jesus. Now, you will find in many areas of Christendom, there's lots of different camps. One say, no, that was Jesus, the Gospels is only for the time of Jesus. It doesn't apply today. They will say the New Testament begins with Acts after Jesus rose from the dead. Well, my understanding is Jesus laid down the rules of the new covenant in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. That is what we're to live by. That is how we're to live. Yes, he spoke to the Pharisees and he referred to the law of Moses. And yes, Jesus was born under the law, subject to the law. But then he instituted his new covenant with his blood when he died and rose again. So what are the terms of the new covenant? Well, those are the terms that he laid down prior to establishing the new covenant. You can't apply any terms of a covenant after it started. The terms of the covenant are established before it starts. And so Jesus came and brought, as he says, as John the Baptist says in John 3, he brings the words from the Father. As Jesus says, the words I speak are not mine, but the words the Father gave me to speak. He brought them down. He says, my words, John 6:63, my words are spirit and they are life. So we are required to know what Jesus says and live by them. And yes, it's complex. It is complicated because the difficulty is separating out when he's talking to the Jews of that day, the religious Jews, and answering their legal questions of the law of Moses, but realizing he's establishing a new law, and they're both separate. The law of Moses came to an end when Jesus shed his blood upon that cross and established the new covenant. That is it. It's over. It's gone. There's now a new covenant. So, for example, Jesus says, forgive and you will be forgiven. If you go to Luke chapter 6, he says in Luke chapter 6, the measure that you use is what I'll use to you. If you forgive, I'll forgive you. We have to live according to the new covenant, so we're not supposed to judge the world. We don't judge the world. Paul says that, judge not the world. So we do not judge the world. If you see a gay pride march walking past and you want to stand there and tell them they're going to hell, well, remember, the police officer on the horse going past happens to not be a Christian. He's going to hell. The butcher in the shop preparing the meat, he's going to hell, married with 2 kids. The lady pushing the pram along the pavement, going to mother care to buy things for the baby. She doesn't believe in Jesus. She's going to hell. So what's different to the group of people walking along in the crowd to everybody else round about? Judge not the world. What we do is we judge not the world, but we walk the narrow path. As it speaks about in Matthew 5, 6 and 7, as you read those teachings, you will find we're required to walk the narrow, difficult path. It is a narrow path and it is difficult because Jesus says it's difficult. If you are still persuaded that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are part of the law, this is what Jesus says. Jesus says the law and the prophets are up until John. Up until John. Until John. So the law and the prophets are up until John. When you actually start reading the words of Jesus and dare to believe him and dare to trust him, that's when you're stepping into the realm of the rule of heaven within your life. Jesus wants to bring you into a path of obedience to him. And what happens is, as we walk this simple, easy path, because what does he do? Say, forgive, show mercy, don't judge, don't condemn. He asks us such gentle things, and he enables us to do it by his Spirit. And as we walk on that path, we arrive at the point where he says, well done, my good and faithful servant. You have not denied me. You've been faithful to what I've said. You've done what I've said. Enter into the joy of the Lord. That's what we seek. So we are then imputed, like Noah, with the righteousness of God that enabled him to get through that terrible time. We are imputed with the righteousness of God. What we do by forgiving people and showing mercy and being kind, we're not in any way saying our righteousness is like God's righteousness. We simply walk in obedience to his teachings as faithful followers of Jesus. And the result of that is that we are credited at the end. Those who endure to the end, we are credited with righteousness by God because we have been found faithful. Brilliant. So that's what it's all about. Biblical righteousness is doing what you've been told to do, Noah did what he was told to do. Abraham did what he was told to do. You will find the covenant of Moses is a set period of time, and they were required to do certain things, and it came to an end with the new covenant. And if you read in the beginning about Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, you will find that he was righteous. Well, how could he be righteous? Because he was doing what was required of him. He was being obedient. He was being faithful. He was living according to the law of Moses and doing everything that was required. I know some people say it's impossible. Well, you're wrong. It's possible under the old covenant to have been found righteous before God, because it required the same thing: being persuaded, being humble. And we are required to live according to the new covenant, which is the teachings of Jesus Christ. Matthew 5, 6 and 7, it's very compact. But then Jesus goes through the teachings and applies it. And then you get to the dynamite section at the end of John, where in 13, 14, 15, 16 and 17, many keys are revealed for unlocking the teachings of Jesus Christ in that section. So biblical righteousness is basically doing what you are required by God to do. And the law of Moses is finished. It's over. It's gone. We now live under the new covenant, and that's the teachings of Jesus Christ. And that's why he came. He came to reveal the words the Father gave him. As it says in John 6:63, I said this, my words are spirit and they are life, Jesus says. In Matthew chapter 4, in the temptation of Jesus Christ, the first thing Jesus says to rebuke the kingdom of darkness, the enemy, was to say, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Question: when did God have a mouth? Answer: Jesus Christ. But is Jesus Christ God? Look at the second temptation. Thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God, Jesus says. Who's being tempted? Jesus Christ. Thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. And then the final one, when the devil says, come and serve me and I'll give you all this. Jesus says the final thing, this is the final key. He says, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and only him shalt thou serve. Notice the interaction between the word worship and serve. When you walk serving Jesus Christ in obedience to him, when you walk in obedience to what Jesus teaches, you're actually worshipping him. Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and only him shalt thou serve. Remember, when they went up to the temple to worship God, what did they do? Go up to the temple 3 times a year in obedience, offering their sacrifices in obedience, and that's called worship. Worship is actually serving. How do we serve Jesus Christ? He says, those who hear my words and do it. Those who hear my words and do it. And that's all you're required to do. Interestingly, in John, he says, my words sanctify you. So our requirement is to walk in biblical righteousness, which is to do what we're required to do. What am I asking you to do, Christian? It's simple. Hear Jesus Christ. Listen to him and walk in obedience to him. That's biblical righteousness. Shalom in Jesus' name.